Pam, you ready?
Yep.
Lake effect snow and northern winds stopping you from getting your necessary exercise and seeing your neighbors? Black Rock Community Center is a place disconnected from northeastern climate conditions, but connected to your local community. A place where movement isn't restricted to one's physical abilities, where activity and socialization are guaranteed before leaving the building, through an intricate spatial connection system that circumnavigates the entire facility, simultaneously functioning as an indoor jogging track, where all ranges of diversity can coalesce to operate as a functioning community.
So within the urban setting of Black Rock, there are a few outlets which the locals can visit for their next necessary exercise or for leisure. One option is Unity Island, directly adjacent to Black Rock, separated by a boulevard, a highway, and a river. The other is Delaware Park, several miles east. While both of these are viable options to conduct various activities, the one overarching and deal-breaking factor is Buffalo's unforgiving climate. During most times of the year, the temperature is uncomfortably cold and windy due to the adjacent Great Lake. Because of this, I am proposing that Black Rock's new community center, Fulcrum, will function as an activity promoting center. Not necessarily a place where members of the community are meant to work out, but a spatial connection system that allows the members of the community to develop relationships, as well as a place to promote exercise during the cold winter months. An indoor jogging tunnel that is on the second level, called the activity tunnel, will circumnavigate the community center facilities, giving a 360-degree view of Black Rock as it exists approximately 25 feet off the ground level. The tunnel will also act as a connection between spaces and somewhere to promote movement while socializing. In order to break up the infinity-shaped loop, spaces of respite exist approximately every 40 to 60 feet, giving visitors the opportunity to take a break and sit and look out into the city. Beginning the project, I was drawn to some of the work graphic designer Micah Dowbeck, and more specifically these eccentric cityscapes that are often in the backdrop of his illustrations. They appear quite heavily layered and dense to a point of an unrealistic exaggeration of urbanism, and seem to refer to the natural growth of urban complexity in some way. But I sort of saw this as a design opportunity. This diagram here is an example of how I would start to use the spatial density of this project. This locker room is sandwiched between two sets of stairs and sun shading panels, which provide a function as well as begin to add another level of this urban complexity. I started looking at some real-life examples of layering and secondary skins from morphosis. Here with a more closely relatable environment to the previous work, the Sun Tower in Seoul. Then with the San Francisco Federal Building, the project starts peeling down over the additional program spaces within its courtyard. And with the Cooper Union, it begins to interact with the public realm in some way. Here from the east facade of Niagara Street, the shading panel system dances around the volumes of the community center, spilling over the activity tunnel in some places and nearly touching the sidewalk, and coming up over the workshop, hiding some of its mechanical and exhaust systems, but also hinting that they're there. The perforated metal panels, however, do allow some lighting to seep through the glazing beneath, Here you can better see the panel's performative qualities in 3 dimensions as it spills over the tunnel and curls over the workshop roof. So starting to look at some of the spaces in plan, here on the north end of this site adjacent to Niagara Street, the entrance to the community center exists. This is the direction people would be coming from on foot if they're visiting. Here into the glazed first level, you would enter into reception and a cafe, and also have access to an elevator. Into the hallway, there are some classrooms, a children's space, administrative offices, and a meeting room. And here at number 8 and 3 and 1 are the fire escapes that extend through all 3 levels. This large open space here was intended to extend the public realm and create a more direct and uninterrupted path of circulation for people on bicycles and people going to the pedestrian bridge. In this space, there would be various activities to partake in, such as chess tables, public community gatherings, and films being shown projected on the back of this western sun shading wall here. And on the second level, where the activity tunnel exists, there'd be a locker room and the mechanical room on the right here. And on the left, there'd be a small auditorium space and the exercise room adjacent to the activity tunnel. On the third level, there's the basketball court with various ways of egress and circulation, as well as resting places and views out. And on the left is where the fabrication workshop is located. In this section facing east, you can better see how all these spaces are located in relation to each other. The workshop in the top right, basketball court on the left, and the 3 cuts through the activity tunnel here, here, and here. The auditorium space here, and the outdoor gathering space beneath that. In this section cut facing west, looking from Niagara Street, again, you see the basketball court and the locker room, and the 3 cuts of the activity tunnel again, and the entry spaces down here. And this is a south-facing section cut of some of the spaces mentioned before. On the left is Niagara Street, and on the right is where the I-90 is, where it dips down. In addition to sun shading panels, on diagram 2, the passive systems also include a collection of solar panels that are highlighted in red that are above the gymnasium space. These also act as shading panels in a sense, as they diffuse some of the light that goes through the gym's skylight. And here in diagram 3, you can see some of the major columns highlighted in red and the 7 feet deep floor and ceiling joists that hold up the larger spaces in the project. Since the building is lifted from the ground to provide space for the public, it's necessary for the structure to be this dense in some areas. And on the 4th diagram here, highlighted in red are the fire escapes, and the squares marked A and B are the locations of the mechanical rooms and some of the various systems that branch off from those locations. And thank you.
There's a GIF at the end of your Your board presentation. What is that? It's just not loading for me. I'm trying to.
I just threw it in there. It's just a rotation of the sun on the site just to see how that works.
First, I just have a question about your process. Did you make any physical models?
I did, but I didn't put them in the presentation.
Why didn't you put them in?
I was trying to keep it concise, and they weren't too. I guess I probably could have used the massing model. That would have been was something I made early on the semester. It was made of paper, but I suppose it would have been helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the reason I ask, I really appreciate so many things about the project, and it's beautifully conceived and represented. The drawings are really wonderful and quite clear, and I think I'm really drawn to talk about your the tendencies towards fragmentation and the kind of collision of various volumes, and what types of spaces that opens up, particularly sectionally, and opportunities for connection and other subtle nuances that happen when things crash into each other. And I think you're doing a very good job starting to kind of recognize some of those opportunities and accentuate them. And I'm really curious about what the role of the physical model is within that process. I would imagine it's significant, but I'd like if you could talk about that. I think that would help me to kind of better wrap my head around what you're doing.
Personally, I don't do a whole lot of like sketch models. I usually draw things by hand and come up with ideas that way. I'm much of a physical model kind of guy, but I do them.
So then in terms of those kind of mashups of different spaces, are they happening in Rhino?
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then for you, then the sections. How are you working out the sections then as a part of the process?
I sort of designed this in terms of massing rather than thinking about things sectionally, if that's what you're into the process of designing this. Yeah, I guess, I suppose I did think about it sectionally in some sense. It's sort of, yeah, I'm not too sure actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so many overlapping, intersecting spaces that are really wonderful to contemplate and to look more closely at, and the kind of awkward slanting, kilting, you mentioned morphosis, those kinds of, geometries against some of the more straightforward box-like spaces. I think all that produces some really interesting experiences. Right. And so I find myself wanting to learn more about, how you conceived of that, your process of working through that, what you're intending to emphasize as you work through those kind of cuts and slices and collisions, and, what ultimately you learn as you operate that way, however it is you do it, whether it's through the sketch or how it is that you're figuring things out. But I'm interested in these kind of spatially plastic maneuvers, and the role that they play for you in terms of highlighting the most significant parts of the building, what you think it's doing and why.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, for me, phenomenal for the representation aspect of it. And I start to look at it, and as I look at the plans and look at the sections, it seems like the plans have a certain level of resolution, but then when we look at the sections, these shifts and these collisions are the things that begin. They don't come into question, but there seems to be sort of a contrast between the two. The plan feels like it's very, very kind of worked out, but then sort of the fun spatial moments are happening in sections where I think they're supposed to happen. I mean, the sections, that's where you're going to read all of that. So like the process for me too is interesting. Like we don't see any process work in this final thing, in this final production. Hence maybe Dennis's also request for the model, or seeing like what the steps were in sort of figuring this out. I guess for me too, like as you're doing it, I'm assuming like you're constantly going back and forth and negotiating. I don't think it's sort of a formal kind of composition and then plugging program in. I'm assuming there's like a conscious decision as to where these things are going. Is that correct? Or is it mass composition and then I plug things in where they seem to fit?
No, yeah. At the beginning of the semester, we spent a lot of time coming up with the program in the relationship between each other. So we spent probably like 2 or 3 weeks on that alone. So that was how I worked that out.
Yeah, because I think it's gotten to like a very sophisticated sort of level by working through that. The one thing like I sort of wish that I saw in this, if I could wish for something here, would be like going back to your work or looking at morphosis and understanding that, and like the idea of layers and skins, right? That's one thing I think that is somewhat lacking maybe in the presentation. Like we see the final massing, the shell, we understand the sectionality of it, but like if you look at Morphosis's work, both in LA or Cooper Union in New York, they all take on a quality as like the time of day shifts, right? So how do you begin to represent that? How do you begin to represent your building over the course of a day? So like those become lanterns at night. They begin to illuminate and radiate out. And so I think there's another way of seeing your building that isn't being presented right now, and that sort of once the insides are kind of reflected outwards at a different time of the day, which could be quite interesting, and we're going to see it in a very different way as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, it seems like we're starting to clarify the process a little bit, which seems programmatic kind of first priority, developing volumes based on program, collision of those masses, I suppose, to generate the overall form. I guess that what that leads to is what kind of my colleagues are talking about, is that there's less of a refinement in some of the detail, I think, relationships. And I agree. I think the graphics are great. I think you've got a really good eye for that. And typically you have, but maybe explaining some of those relationships is where I'm a little bit lost. So one of the things I think there's an opportunity for is specifically the ground level. I think you've brought up opportunities in thinking about precedents from Morphosis and just even thinking about some OMA projects. There's like the Wiley Theater, and they've got these like metallic skins and structures. But if we zoom in on the ground kind of like floor plan, there seems to be a lost opportunity to react to the structure a bit. So you've elevated the building, you've provided kind of like these throughways for people. But I'm wondering if there's the relationships to the landscaping even that could kind of help accentuate some of those nodal points that exist because of the columns kind of getting dropped down. So there's a bit of resolution. And again, I think there's such a complex geometry that's happening within the entire project that's a bit more sophisticated. But I think what's great about Morphosis and some of those other firms is that there's always a dynamic relationship between building structure, no matter how crazy it is, but also back to site relationships and ground and how it meets ground. So I think that transition in logic would be super beneficial to figure out, like, to what resolution now do you need to refine some of the spatial aspects? And I agree again with my colleagues about the sectional component. The plan seems inevitable just because of the way I'm imagining that you've collided these things in Rhino, right? Like when you take those volumes and like kind of mash them up and Boolean union them, inevitably the plan will like occupy, I guess, the necessary square footage for whatever activity you have, right? But in section, it seems like there isn't a reaction afterwards. So that kind of vertical development, I think, as a layer to the project will only help kind of enhance it or clarify it even more. So one of the things that I thought was interesting in the plan was the kind of tunnel that you keep talking about. So there's this interweaving kind of circulation diagram that follows suit with public and private spaces, and it's becomes a track, right? It kind of just, I guess, locally, it reminds me of North Campus's stadium, where like you see people running around you as a part of the circulation. But again, I think sectionally that kind of remains in one level and doesn't really kind of take its form anywhere else. So I wonder if there's like potential to even think about the cross overlap and intersection from the first floor to the third floor, what those relationships are, even in programmatic, I guess, arrangement, right? So like some of the things I'm kind of like iffy about are seeing, there was a point where I saw the plans and they're like the children's room and like the admin office kind of like close to each other. And I wonder if that's the right place for them. So some things I think have defaulted just out of the form, because it's hard to manipulate it after the fact, right? You kind of need to plug the program in and just kind of fit everything in. And I question whether the form can actually help with some of those programmatic relationships a bit more. So the track as a unifying element or a circulation element, I thought was pretty impressive. But I think the branching off of that track, there's some like elements of adjacent program that I'm kind of questioning at the moment. And then I guess for you, like you mentioned, I think there was like really interesting concepts of movement when you pitched it in the beginning, and then the idea of like 360 view around BlackRock. I keep coming back to context because I think this is such a really interesting site. And I think in a lot of the projects, there definitely have been site analysis, but towards the end of the presentation, it gets lost and I guess what your relationship is. So again, I think the tunnel is like a really interesting thing, but what are your opinions on the kind of, maybe just to reiterate, like the screening logic over top of your massing? Was it just a unifying element, I guess, for the volumes, or how is it playing a role in terms of relationship back to context, or even kind of reactions to program behind the screen?
Yeah, I think I was more so thinking about it in terms of like the design, like formal concept rather than maybe like a contextual concept. It was more so like adding to that sort of density I was aiming for to begin with. But it also, like, obviously it's also a passive system in itself, so it acts as checks off that list of the studio's kind of focus this semester, I guess.
Right, and I think that's a good point. I mean, so this is what I think my intuition is that you guys are given a list, right, in terms of comprehensive studio to kind of check off, which includes egress, mechanical systems, passive kind of, I guess, design, right? So I guess maybe this is an overall comment as well. It's like, how do those things react relative to your mission statement as a part of the design? And it's not just something that you check off, but rather when you incorporate the program and have to deal with all these like integration issues, how do they amplify the design, right? So I think in your case specifically, there's so many overlapping moments where I think the intersection of like what happens when mechanical meets passive system versus circulation, that kind of, I guess, complicated scenario is where I'm hoping for some kind of, there potentially is a sectional quality there that can help merge those together, right? So they're not so foreign to each other.
Any other comments or questions, Sam?
Great presentation material though, and I agree about the process. Include that.
Okay. Thanks, Sam.